So hi everyone. We're really glad that you came again for session 3 on our Scholarly Writing Institute, and today we're going to be focusing on qualitative analysis. That we'll do some introductions. Dr. Jessica Parker, she's the owner of Dissertation by Design, and we've been working with Dissertation by Design for a couple of years now. It's been a great partnership. And today, our presenter on qualitative analysis is Dr. Veronica Richard. And so she'll be presenting, and yeah, the last 2 days, it was Dr. Desi Richter who was presenting. So hi, Veronica.
Hey, everyone. Great to be here.
And then for the softwares, so at the end, I'm just going to show how Citavi integrates with NVivo. At the end, I'm Stacy Penna. I'm the NVivo and Citavi Community Director at QSR International. And then our NVivo expert, Laura Lagendijk, will be doing the NVivo presentation, and that will take up most of the time for the software presentation. So hi, Laura.
Hi everyone, Laura coming from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in southern Alberta, Canada. Glad to be here.
And so today's just agenda, so description of the session, and so 40 minutes will be with Veronica going over a qualitative analysis, and then Laura will be showing you about 30 minutes of NVivo, and then I'll do a quick tour of how Citavi works with NVivo, and then we'll take questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to make Veronica our presenter.
All right, everyone. Well, we have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to go quickly through these first few slides. Just a little bit about myself. I have worked with Dissertation by Design for going on 3 years now, and have the pleasure of working with people all over the world, and I absolutely love my job because of that. I am a qualitative research expert by training. There are a few of us, but I love that aspect of my job as well. And I've been working with researchers and doc students for 14 years now in my work at universities and now at Dissertation by Design. So today we'll go through and look at the value of a data management plan and a data analysis plan, and why those two things are critical as we move forward into the analysis processes. We'll look at the importance of cleaning up our data and listening to the transcripts, making sure that they're accurate in relationship to the audios or videos that we have. And then, and also some memoing. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then we'll go into some initial analysis and coding processes, and then second round analysis of pattern matching, and then theme identification. Ultimately, what we're leading to for today is understanding how our analysis informs our future data collection in some cases, and mostly our writing of our qualitative findings, which is where we'll pick up tomorrow and focus a little bit more on the writing aspect. But we can't write without the analysis. So let's talk about your data management plan or processes. Do you have a plan? Yes or no, or answer these 3 questions. And I think Stacy.
All right, and I'll share. So it looks like 41% people of the respondents say I do not have a management plan, 49% say I have a general management plan, and 9% say I have a specific step-by-step management plan. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for doing that. I think that this is very common I think a lot of us don't think about what we're going to do with the data until we get it, and then we're like, oh my gosh, what am I, how am I going to do this? Sometimes our institutional review boards, which in the United States is our governing bodies at different universities that make sure that we're handling data with ethics and responsibility. Sometimes when we get to that stage, we refine our processes a little bit, but even then, sometimes that they're just vague. Okay, so we want to make sure that we are specific in our plan of our management and our analysis. So let's see how we can do that. If I can get my slides to work here. There we go. All right. So first of all, we want to consider our research design, and then looking at digitizing and storing data, and then checking for accuracy and our memoing. So our research design in both qualitative and quantitative research should guide everything that we do in our analysis and our writing up of our findings, and that connection, that alignment can be very important and helpful as we move through this process. So if you see over here, I've just listed a few qualitative research designs. This idea of essential qualitative research, some people call this basic qualitative research. Maria Lehman, Dr. Maria Lehman refers to this as essential qualitative research. I kind of like that term better, just because it is not, qualitative in my mind is not just basic, right? So anyway, here are a few designs, and then here's some different things that how we might organize our data. So I might have a single level organization, perhaps by participant or by data management, or excuse me, by the type of data. And we'll take a look and see what that looks like here in a moment. Or I might have a multiple level of organization for my files, depending on how much data I have, how many participants I have, and the type of research design. So let's check that out here. All right, so if I have a single level organization, I might organize my files according to participant. This would be appropriate in essential qualitative research, narrative, phenomenology studies. And so here we just have this one level, and I might put all of my files in my one participant one, all of their files go together, okay? This is pretty common. Another way that we might look at it in case studies, ethnography, or grounded theory studies, in that I might organize by the case. And in some ways, IPA studies are about the case as well. An individual person is a case. So how this might look differently is instead of case up here at the superordinate level, I might have participant one, and then I might have interview one, interview two, interview three underneath that. Okay. If I'm doing case study, I might have different participants as this is represented here, participant 1, 2, and 3, and then their data within it, whether it's interviews, observations, or maybe even some documents. So once I get what I think my folders are going to look like, then I can start thinking about digitizing and storing my data. So when I talk about digitizing, I really want to convey that the importance comes in, what do I have to do to the data to digitize it? So if I have a document that's a hard copy, am I going to scan it? Am I going to retype it up? What am I going to do to be able to store this digitally? Or am I going to keep it in the document format and maybe just store it in my locked file cabinet or something like that? So there are some key questions to guide us in thinking through these processes. The first one is, based on the data you have, what do you need to digitize? So think about if I have a file coming back from a transcription company, that is the data, okay? But I also have the audio data. So am I going to store both of them, or am I just going to check the accuracy and then delete that audio or video file? This is something that your governing ethics body or board from your university will want to know. If I decide to, if I have observation data, for example, that's by hand, I might want to scan it and then shred the actual observation document that I had to begin with. Okay, so that's one thing that you want to think about. The next thing is, where will you store the data and where will you back up the data? Fortunately, today we have a lot of different ways to do this. I can use an external drive. I can use the cloud. But whatever we do, remember, we have to make sure that these areas are secure. And again, our ethics board will want to know where we're storing the data and how we're protecting it. And then finally, how will I maximize the security and confidentiality of the files? I want to de-identify the data. In qualitative research, we do want to honor the participants by actually using names for the most part. Sometimes there are circumstances where we might want to use numbers instead, but by and large, we do want to use the participant's pseudonym that they've chosen. And if so, I want to immediately assign those pseudonyms to the files, and so that I'm the only one who knows the connection between the actual participant's name and their data. Okay. Now, once I have all the data organized, or at least my first round of data collection organized and stored in files, and I have access to it, now it's time for me to start checking for accuracy and then getting a general understanding of what's going on in the data through memoing. And so my first step is reading and rereading and checking for accuracy, which is about listening and reading. So listening to the audio or videotape recording, and then checking the transcript if I have interviews. If I am looking at observations, I want to actually go through the documents and make sure that I've spelled things correctly. Is there anything I want to add? And I want to do this as quickly as possible after the data collection session. In this process of reading and checking for accuracy and listening, I want to identify vague words and give them more identifying language and descriptive language. And then in my memoing, I really am getting just my initial thoughts and impressions. They may hold through all the way to the end, and they may not. I also want to note my reflexive thinking and who am I in this research? Did I have any specific thoughts like, oh, I agree with you because I've experienced that? Did I say that, or did I think it? And those are those times that I want to take those reflexive notes. If there's a time, perhaps too, if I'm feeling like the participant is maybe getting emotional or something like that, I might want to note that and what I'm going to do about that. So here's an example of checking for vague language. I have identified some of the vague language in this transcript. There are some it's highlighted there, and then some acronyms, and I'll talk about those separately here. So the it, I put in brackets the actual noun that the pronoun it stands for, and I had to go back into the early part of this sentence to get that. So I put it in brackets. Then there's a program, okay, that we host here, And I'm not sure what that program is. And I'm still not sure actually in going through the transcript. So I might have to go back and ask this person in the follow-up interview if there was another program that she was talking about other than this Emerging Leaders program. So here we have this Emerging Leaders program and then the acronym down here. So I just put a line to show the connection between that so that I have to become familiar with the language that my participants are using. Here's one, this PEP, have been some PEP projects. So I have no idea what PEP projects means, so let me go back. Then I play in other spaces outside of talent development. Things like performance management, employee engagement, rewards and recognition have been some PEP. Oh, I wonder if it means PET projects. So if I had this transcript, I would put PET in brackets and put a question mark. And then I'd want to also listen to the audio tape again to see if the transcriptionist didn't make a mistake here. Okay. And then as you can see, I continue to go through and identify some of those pronouns that make it difficult to understand. Okay. The idea of this cleaning up of the data is that eventually I'm going to have to take apart, I'm going to take the quotes and put them and organize them according to codes. So I'm not going to have the full transcript here to be able to go back and go, what did it mean? So that's why this process is so important. I want to make sure that the segments of data make sense. And interestingly enough, this process of cleaning up the data will continue all the way into our writing. Now, when we look at our memoing and reflexivity here, here's the same transcript, and now I'm putting my memos on it. Just know that when I went through this transcript before, I had the yellow highlights and everything all together, but I thought it was a little bit too much for the slide, so that's why I separated it. But here you see a memo. I'm noticing that the language used to talk about professional development conveys a nuanced meaning that language is a part of culture, which is interesting. And then down here, we have this quote that culture is unspoken. And I said, oh, well, maybe this is a feeling by beliefs, norms, behaviors, expectations. I wonder if this idea will continue to surface. That should say surface, not service. A possible code here could be culture as feeling. So I'm already thinking about my analysis, but I'm not spending a lot of time. I'm just tracking my ideas and then letting it go. Up here, I have noted that I think this is about the person's behaviors and actions, so I went ahead and noted it. But again, this is a quick process, so we just go through, check for accuracy, note our thoughts, and then move forward. Later in the presentation, Laura will take us through NVivo and show you how the data management process and cleaning up the data can happen in NVivo, or perhaps should happen outside of NVivo as far as the cleaning up of the data. Okay, so now that we've got our data in a process where we can work with it, we have access to it, it's stored in organized files and things like that. Now I can start thinking about my analysis. So what is analysis? As far as qualitative research goes, it's a two-part process with analysis and interpretation. So analysis is messy, it's ongoing, and as we'll see tomorrow, our analysis goes all the way into the writing process, even though some people, I don't think, acknowledge that aspect of qualitative data analysis. It is ongoing all the way through to the analysis. Qualitative analysis is strategic. It is both an inductive and deductive process. Almost always, whether we're doing an inductive analysis to start with or a deductive analysis to start with, we go into the other form of analysis eventually. And I'll give you some examples of that today. Next, we have a detailed examination of the data. It is micro level and macro level. And then it is a methodical and systematic process, which goes back to that strategic aspect. And then also intuitive and creative. Many, many researchers talk about qualitative research, and these are the components that really stand out. Let's see, Vanover, Mijas, and Saldana noted this idea of micro level and macro level, and I really, really like that, because that micro level is that segment of data and coding, which we're going to go into here in a moment. And then that macro level is a more holistic perspective. Let's say if I'm looking at narrative research, I'm looking for a story. So I might be looking at that more holistic level. Okay, so interpretation, on the other hand, is making meaning. So it's about making intentional decisions, memoing, condensing meaning across the data set, and then forming synthesis and patterning. And again, this is informed by Vanover, Mijas, and Saldana. And QSR had several videos with these authors, and hopefully, Stacy, if you can direct people to that, that would be great, because those sessions were very, very helpful. Okay, so in our analysis plan, and some of the documents that I've uploaded for you today talk about the management plan and the analysis plan, and what to anticipate. This is very important. We want to think about, what do we want to know? How do we know that? We go back to our research questions. And then who are we using to support what we're going to do? So am I using Saldana? Am I using, if I'm doing a thematic analysis, am I using Braun and Clark? Those are those experts in the area that I might use in my chapter 3 or my methodology section to support my plan. Okay, so think back to your chapter 3 or your methodology section and your analysis section. That's your plan. What you want is this third question here. Is your plan detailed enough so that someone could replicate your process? This is key. I would say throughout the methodology chapter or section in your document, that's our job, is to make sure that others who come behind us can actually use and build upon what we have done. So this third area is very, very important. And then fourth is, how will you track your decisions as you're going through? Because ultimately, something almost always changes. So this is what we want to know about our plan. Here's a way that you can track your process. So over here in the step column, I have what my plan was. I'm going to contact participants, and then I have the date. I'm going to complete first round of interviews. I'm going to transcribe using NVivo, and then checking accuracy, and then first cycle analysis, second cycle, and it goes on from there, okay? And I'd want to know exactly, when I say on this first cycle analysis, list specific steps you will need to complete. This is very, very important for you not to be guessing when you actually have data. You want to know ahead of time. So this is one way of tracking your process. This is also called an audit trail that people will use to determine the quality of your study. All right, So now let's turn to thematic analysis. In general, all analysis has these 3 steps. I'm calling this thematic analysis because the end goal is to come up with themes. If my end goal was to come up with narratives, then I would still have these 3 steps in my analysis process. They would just be, the goal would be a little slightly different. So I hope that's not too confusing, but even in case study, I go through these steps. Even if I am doing a grounded theory study, I go through these steps in one way or another. So that's why I want to talk about these 3 steps, because no matter what you're doing in your analysis, sooner or later you're going to hit all 3 of these steps. All right, the first round of analysis includes reading and our initial ideas, our initial analysis, and then defining and labeling. And these initial analysis and defining and labeling is also called coding. So if you've heard that term before, that's what those 2 areas are called. So let's take a look and see what that includes. So inductive analysis, we start from the bottom up. We identify codes in an emerging nature. So codes are assigning meaning to segments of data. So first we identify relevant segments of data. How do we know that a segment of data is relevant? We go to our research questions, okay? And then we assign meaning to that, and that's the coding piece. Laura is going to show us what that looks like in NVivo later, but here is what it looks like if we are doing our analyses by hand or using Word document or an Excel document. So this is a study on how international students in a US university describe their listening and speaking experiences with a specific type of presentation in their English for Academic Purposes program. So here's David's interview, first part of it. And this is my first round of inductive analysis. Some people might call this my first round of coding, all right? So I feel really overwhelmed that oh, can I do that? Can I do that? So I put over here, overwhelmed. It's pretty basic, it's pretty literal. That's what this person had said over here, overwhelmed. We'll see how this might change. I might get more specific later, but right now, I'm just gonna go with the overwhelmed. Now, I assign colors to my coding because I want to know what bit of data is causing me to think about the meaning-based code that I'm assigning to it. So in blue here, I memorize all the screen and I just speak it out, like almost by reading them. So here I put over here planning. Is this a plan or is this just this person telling me what they did? So memorizing, reading, speaking, and then I put just speak out. This is called an NVivo code, IN space VIVO, an NVivo code. And what that means is that I've used the words to maybe stand in for that meaning-based code. This doesn't happen often, but it can happen. So, and it does in this next bit here, natural presentation. So it's quite hard for me. So this idea of I should have coded this green, not green, it should be orange for difficult process or emotions. So I apologize there for that mistake. Next, you see blue. I prepare some script, and then I needed to read the following script. And then he goes back into quite hard to present. So you see how I'm kind of breaking up the quote into meaning. And so that's why it's really important for me to highlight the words in the specific colors that I'm assigning it to. okay? Now let's look at deductive analysis. My first round of deductive analysis starts at the top of the triangle. We're using existing categories, okay, to put our data into buckets, if you will. And those buckets are the categories of the framework. So this framework could be theory, it could be areas that emerged from the literature review that I'm using, anything like that, sometimes both. So once I identify the relevant segments of data, how do we determine relevance? Relevance here is determined by the research question and by the framework together. So I have to be thinking of both things in this particular type of analysis. So then I go to the relevant data, to one of the framework categories, and then I can start in this process looking at, is the theory holding true? I have to start with what definition the authors of the theory that I'm using have to assign segments of data. Later, I'm going to see if I need to refine that definition based on the data that I have. Okay, so here's an example. Here you see that there were only 3 areas shown on this particular part of the transcript from this theory that I'm using. This one had to do with anxiety, the effects of anxiety, and then strategies. So you'll see here that I've identified again in color the codes that come into play for this part of the transcript. It's much cleaner as far as the colors go because I'm really just putting them in buckets. I'm not getting particular about meaning, although you'll see in my dashes I am starting to make some distinctions here about the information and what's being conveyed. So that's round 1 of analysis. When I stop my analysis, and by the way, I want to go through one transcript totally before I stop, if at all possible. I want to end with reminding myself what I was thinking. I ended with Maya's transcript. The idea of blank were really strong. I wonder if these ideas are coming to me because I have experienced them too. Okay, so here, these breadcrumbs can really help you as you're moving forward. Second round of analysis, combining looking for patterns, intentional decisions, and refining understanding. In our inductive round of analysis, we group units of data according to patterns of like meaning. In this stage, I am revising my understanding. I'm coming to new understanding with the data. This center stage is the same in deductive analysis too, and we'll see that here in a minute. So now that I'm grouping, I've taken David's transcript and all of his, not all of his data, but enough that fit on this slide about overwhelmed feelings are right here. And now I can start to see there's nervousness here in the, oops, excuse me, hang on. Let me go back. There's nervousness in this 3rd row, 4th row, and 5th row. Very interesting. I'm starting to not only have a pattern for overwhelmed feelings, but now I'm having a sub-pattern of nervousness, which is part of that overwhelmed feelings. Okay. Now, deductive analysis. I'm in the center of the triangle again. I'm still identifying patterns within the categories, and I begin to now start to compare the data within my buckets to that of the actual theory to see if my data is kind of holding true with how the authors of the theory defined their framework or not. It may align, it may not. So let's see what this looks like. Again, we see David here. What I've done is identify strategies to handle anxiety. So now look at all of the the only row, this middle row, is about practice. Everything else is about what they did, like this idea of making a script. This one here is about being, what order am I presenting in? Am I first or am I last? And then here are other strategies when they're actually in the presentation. So I really need more data here to be able to identify patterns within this larger pattern of strategies. Okay. All right. So one way that we can look for these clustering or patterning is to use a table, as I just showed you. So that's one way that you can do that. I'm going to go on in interest of time here. Again, leave breadcrumbs and memos for yourself. And then our third round of analysis, theme identification and definitions, data reduction, deciding what stays in, what goes out, and then cross-checking our data to make sure that we've got everything in the most appropriate space and that I haven't missed something. All right, so now the third round of analysis is at the top of inductive triangle here. We are looking at that again, identification and cross-checking. I am identifying the nuances of meaning, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow when we go into writing. And that just, I want to make a very intentional connection here. All of these rounds of analyses that we've been talking about are leading us to our writing. Essentially, I think of this as our writing. So when we are organizing and pattern matching and deciding what goes where, we are writing. It just doesn't look like writing on a page, okay? So we're identifying nuances of meaning within groups, and we're determining what data stay and what data are out, okay? And then in deductive, we are kind of doing the same thing. We are identifying these nuances of meaning within the larger categories and patterns, and determining which areas, which data will stay and not, and comparing the data with the framework again. And here, we're determining if the data warrants a change to the framework category names or definitions, and they might. In some cases, a category might not even show up in our data. In other cases, a new category might emerge, and that's where that cross between inductive and deductive comes into play. So let's see what this looks like. So here's a cluster of emotions. I've got Allie in here, Ashley, and so just the two of them. But here I see forgetting up here is the meaning. Forgetting is the meaning in the third line. And then forgetting is the meaning in the fourth row. So the first, third, and fourth row, I'm going to want to move these all together to prepare for writing, because I want to talk about them in the same time if they're all about the same meaning, okay? This is super, super important as we prepare to write. Let's see here if I wanted to say anything else on this particular. Oh, yes. You see, I've started to draw a line through words. Well, apparently I missed this in my cleaning up of the data. So I need to get these out. At this time, I want to refine my segments of data so that it's ready for me to use and I don't have to do anything else. When I get to writing, I'll probably still tighten it up, but as I go, I want to continue to refine these quotes so that they make sense to the reader and so that it reads smoothly. All right. Here's what the themes ended up being for that study that I showed you. I want to show you this to let you know that your analysis ultimately leads you to this type of an outline if we're looking at thematic analysis. I don't think I want to say anything more about that. It can be overwhelming, but know that if you've spent your time in analysis, you will get to this stage. All right, again, once you are leaving one of your analysis sessions, make sure that you leave yourself memos. So in this case, the groups of blank and blank seem very close, so I combined them and brought in the theme name. This adjustment made sense to me because, so that part is me justifying my step and what I did and why. And that's that reflexivity piece. And then here, I'm struggling to determine the theme name. Communication will likely be in the name, but the name needs to be more meaningful. So this is me sharing my struggles, and that's quite fine. And I actually like it when researchers do that because it's the reality of what we do as qualitative researchers in analysis. All right, that is the end of my presentation. Stacy?
Great. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Now I'm going to make Laura the presenter so that she can show you NVivo.
Okay, now you're seeing the PowerPoint, I hope, right?
Yes,
so folks, thanks Veronica. Yeah, thanks, Veronica. That was great to get that intro to how we approach coding. Today, I have time to take us into this project. I'm going to be still using the same one that I used yesterday, the sample project that's built into every copy of NVivo, Environmental Change Down East. And I'll show you a little bit more about what that process of coding looks like in NVivo. I also take you through what the folder structure could look like if you were using an approach like thematic analysis that Dr. Veronica just spoke about, and how the codes might evolve over time. I'll talk a little bit about visualizing your data, but if we don't get to that, please know there's a great webinar here in the link, and also a webinar that we did on thematic analysis. So both of those are really good resources for free that you can return to have just some other demos of how NVivo can be used and the different pieces of it that can be used. So now let's jump back into the sample project. And I have adapted the sample project that was built into NVivo to do a little bit of demonstration of how the coding evolves over time and the different approaches that we spoke about. But when you are working in NVivo, you will open and create a new project that has almost nothing in it. It will have these kind of high-level folders, but not much else in it. It wouldn't even have anything in here. And the first thing that you need to do is think about importing your data and how that's going to look. And remember, Dr. Veronica said, you know, it's important that your data is clean. Well, what does that mean? It means that it's well named so that you can distinguish between certain pieces of data. It also means that things that you aren't interested in including, let's say you've done a survey, because NVivo can also handle, you know, open-ended responses from your survey questions, that you've gone through and made sure that all of the entries in the survey are really what you want to bring into NVivo, those kinds of things. Just so you know, this type of data, there are many types of data that can come into NVivo beyond documents. So by hovering over, I'm on the import ribbon here, I'm hovering over the various data types, and you can see that you can bring in documents, text files, PDFs, audio, video, and images. I know that Stacy put in the chat that there's some webinars on how you can actually do your transcription in NVivo. If you've used NVivo transcription, which is a service to do the transcribing from your audio and video files, you can also bring that in directly here from the modules, and you can bring in the NVivo transcription files. So you upload your audio or video files to NVivo transcription, and then you can download the transcripts directly into NVivo. Going back onto the import ribbon, just notice there's different survey types that you can bring into NVivo. By clicking here, I can bring in Excel or survey data from SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics. And we spoke about on Tuesday the different bibliographic software, etc. You can even bring in data from email, Twitter feed, Facebook feed, social media data. There are many other kinds of data. So the data cleaning that you need to do may be very specific to the type of data that you're bringing into the project. For the most part, I suggest doing the cleanup in the program that the data was created in. So if I'm bringing a survey into NVivo and I've got that survey in an Excel file, I would do my data cleaning in Excel. And if it was done in audio file and I'm going to do any cleanup or editing of the audio file in NVivo, or not in NVivo, in the program that it was created in. So best to do that cleanup in the program it was created in and then import it into NVivo. So how am I going to organize my files in NVivo? Well, in this sample project, it's been organized by having the different various data types by folder. And that's one way of doing it. Sometimes people have different folders, one for their interviews, one for their focus groups, one for the literature they've brought into the project, etc. And in other ways of organizing the data, they organize it. Let's say if you're doing a case study, you might have a folder for each of your cases. So the way that you organize that really depends on the way that you think about the data and the method that you're using. And it's not written in stone. Once the data is in NVivo, you can move it around even if there's been some coding done on it. So how does this process of coding look? I'm just going to concentrate on the Word document data this time, and I'm just trying to change one thing here. Hold on. Okay. Thank you. So I've got, let's say, the interviews brought into my project, and these are interviews that were really done as a part of a real research study for environmental change and have been used as a sample project in NVivo for many, many years. So if you wanted, you could open one of the interviews, or once you have your own data in, and the way we typically begin to do that kind of coding process is by reading and reflecting on the data. So I'm just clicking on Susan's interview here to open it. So if I was bringing this in, I would be reading and reflecting, and I want to make some notes on what I'm seeing in the data, maybe even before I've done any coding. And we've talked multiple times about the importance of memoing and making notes about what you're seeing and thinking and leaving that breadcrumb trail that Dr. Veronica spoke about. And the way we do that in NVivo is by creating memos. So let me just select here, and I'm going to go down to the memos folder, and you'll see that there's lots of memos that have been created in this project already, but I'm going to create a new memo just to show you the process. And I'm going to call this Laura's Analysis Journal. And in my analysis journal, I might be making lots and lots of notes about the kinds of things that I'm seeing, leaving that breadcrumb trail for me to actually go back to and make notes on. You can actually date stamp the memo, and then I begin to enter my thoughts. So I've got my data in here, and I'm reading it and beginning to think about it, and I'm going back and forth about what those notes are in my analysis journal. Okay. Now, after I've done the reading of most of the transcripts and made my notes, again, depending on the kind of approach to coding we're taking, I'll probably want to start doing some coding. So what does that process look like? Well, let me just go back here to this coding file. Depending on the approach to this, it's being really slow to respond here. Let's try this. There we go. So depending on the approach to coding that we're using, it's very possible that I start with no codes whatsoever. And as I'm reading and thinking about the data, then I would be going through and creating codes as I needed them to reflect the topics or my thoughts about what I'm seeing how it relates to the research question. So here you'll see in Susan's interview that she's lived away for 9 years. She means away from the area in the Down East study. She was in college and teaching. She really didn't want to come back, etc. But eventually she does. So then I think this is a meaningful piece of that sense of community that I've been reading about in the interviews. I'm ready to start coding now. I'll highlight that data. And then there are multiple ways to do the coding in NVivo. One way is simply by dragging this section over here, and it's going to allow me to create a new code. And I'm going to say this is living away and coming back. And in here, I would enter a description of what I think belongs in this code. So this is participants' reflections on moving out and back from the community. And that description in the code then allows me to remember what kinds of information belong in that code. And you might remember yesterday I talked about being able to export the code book and the list of codes and the descriptions that kind of act as definitions of the code. And exporting those code books on a regular basis as your coding structure changes over time, then allows you to document what you've done as part of your study, how your coding structure started, how it evolved after you had a first round of interviews, how it evolved after a second round of interviews, etc. So that process of coding, if I now go back and look at my code, living away and coming back, you'll see that if it's going to open for us, there it goes. You'll see that I now have that little piece of Susan's interview put in the place or the code about living away and coming back. And as I proceed in my coding, I would then perhaps open another interview like William's interview or a different, let's see if we've got one here. I'll open William's interview. And perhaps he's also talked about that somewhere. And if he did talk about moving away and coming back, then I would be able to also code that to the same code. So I'm not sure if it's this part, but we'll pretend this is about moving away and, oh, he's talking about going back and forth. So I'm going to take his whole paragraph and also code it to that same code. Again, there's multiple ways to do the same function in NVivo. So I could simply right-click and code that selection to a recent code. And I'm going to put that also in the living away and coming back code. And if I go through now and look at it, you'll see that both pieces of the coding are now in that code. I can see that this one came from Susan's interview and this one came from William's interview. And as we start to build up our coding, you'll see more and more references or pieces of text that are about this topic in this code. If we go and look at some of the codes that were created in the project by the analysts who were doing the work for this sample project, you'll see a number of different codes, and they should all be reflective of what you of the topic or the name of that code. So this code is about balance, and you'll see that Barbara's interview has something about balance, and so does Helen's interview, so does Ken's interview, Thomas's interview, and so on. Sometimes they'll actually use the word balance, and sometimes they won't. For instance, in this piece about Ken's interview, he talks about the runoff and the less stuff you're going to have that you want to have in the water. And maybe I'm not sure if that's really about balance. Was this really supposed to be here? I'm not sure. And I can look at that and jump back to Ken's interview. And we'll see that Ken's interview is actually a video file. And what this comes from is the transcript of his video file. And I can then look for a little bit more context around what was put in that code to be sure that it really belongs there. So as Dr. Veronica talked about, we're always going back and forth, looking at the codes, thinking about what belongs in there, and moving, kind of thinking about the data as we're reading it, thinking about it as we're coding it, and then later on when we start to rearrange and move our codes around, you're exploring what's in those codes and being sure that only the topic that the code is about is represented in that code. So it's always an iterative process until you get to kind of the end, or you're at the end of your time doing your dissertation and your supervisor has said, hey, you've got to finish up now, and you're pushed to the end. So what do things look like once they've been coded? If I go back to Susan's interview, and there's lots of coding on Susan's interview, the way I have things here, it doesn't look any different. But there are visualizations built into NVivo that will allow you to see what coding has been done. So I can come up here and turn on what are called the coding stripes. And if I turn on all of the coding stripes, you'll see a visual representation by these stripes on the side of what pieces have been coded where. Now you'll see things have been coded in multiple times in this sample project because I've been using it a lot in different places. But what you're seeing here is a visual representation. This code is local identity, and this coding stripe is showing me that this piece of the text is coded to that code called local identity. And I can also click on that coding stripe and have it show me everything in Susan's interview that's been coded to local identity. So now I can kind of scroll through and get a sense of what's in there. So those coding stripes help me kind of get a look at how much of Susan's interview has been coded at local identity. And where else has Susan's interview been coded? By scrolling back and forth across those coding stripes. So the coding stripes and the highlighting give you a sense of what's been coded. You have options about how many of those coding stripes to show up. Perhaps I'm just interested to see if it showed up in a certain code. And then I could select, and it opened in my other window. I'm just going to move it up once it's done loading. I could come here and get a sense of where has Susan's interview been coded, and everything that's bolded here shows me that these codes are on Susan's interview, and I maybe just want to see where it's been coded, let's say to environmental change and natural environment, and I can clear off, let me just clear off all those other ones, that'll be faster, and just have a look at where it's been coded to the natural environment. And that gives me a little bit cleaner look of what I'm seeing in the coding stripes. So as I'm moving through and coding, if I want, I can have the coding stripes on. I can also turn them off. Same with the highlighting. I can have it on or turned off. They're all ways of showing you what's been coded in certain places. In a similar way, if you're in a code and you want to see where else certain things have been coded, and this can really help when you're making some decisions about, do I have too much overlap in certain codes? You can come into the code itself and also turn on the coding stripes. So I'm in my balance code now, and I can see balance has been coded at many different places, but perhaps I want to just see if there's any overlap, let's say with something like community change. And is anybody talking about that? So let me just clear off that. And I can just see where it's been coded at, where the balance code has been coded at community change. And there doesn't seem to be a lot of overlap on that. So I'm getting more confident that those two concepts are distinct as I move forward in my coding. So when I'm first approaching the codes, especially if I'm using an inductive approach, I may have a long list of codes that have been developed as I do that process. And then as I move to that second round where I'm really looking for the patterns and starting to think about how these topics fit together under a theme, I would want to probably build in some hierarchy. And I'm moving codes around. And when you move a code around, all of the coding comes with it. So in this sample project, this is kind of the structure they had already built, but let me show you if I open a folder where I've got my inductive approach to codes, and just I want to point out I've built both kinds of approaches into this project for the purposes of demonstration. It's not usual that you would have both of these folders in the same project, although Dr. Veronica spoke about, and I agree, that we're always doing a little bit of inductive and deductive. The general coding structure that you start with is probably just going to be one of these approaches. So now I'm going into a folder that I created for demonstration, some of the same codes, but let's say I'm using an inductive approach to coding. And as I've been reading and coding, I'm getting a lot of ideas, and I've got a lot of codes and a lot of files coded to them, a lot of references coded in those codes. And now I'm going to look at this big list of codes and panic a little bit and think, what am I going to do with all of these and how do they all fit together? And this is an important time to remember that you've got research questions and your memos that you've been keeping along the way, and that you're going to start moving those codes around to answer the research questions that you have. So perhaps I'm really interested in this project about environmental change and the sense of community, the economy, perhaps, those kinds of things. And I see, just from what my initial codes have developed, the codes that I've developed, potential ways of fitting some of these codes together. So I'm going to then come into the codes that I've created and begin reviewing them the way that I showed you and reorganizing them. And then I might make a copy of all of these codes, and I'm going to put them in a new folder. And here I've started to move them around and make some hierarchy. And the hierarchy is really a way of visually representing what you're starting to think of as themes. Those top level codes would be themes, but also helps you kind of remember and put together in a way that's you can wrap your head around all of the topics that you've got here. So if I've got a code like community change, and I think that's actually maybe part of this theme that's building the sense of community down east, I can simply take this code and drag it down onto the sense of community down east and have a look at that, and also come in and look at the topics that are represented here and make some decisions about whether what's in community change really is part of this theme of sense of community down east. I'm going to say yes to save my project and say okay to this. Oh, don't crash. Cancel. It's going to crash on me? Hopefully not. So then one of the other things that you might be interested in doing is actually having a look at everything that is in that code. And it is, NVivo is not responding. I may have to close out and come back. Everything that's in that code at once, so that as I'm looking at all of the topics that are coded beneath this theme level code, do they really all fit? Is it very cohesive? Is it giving me a very clear sense of what's in that theme? And I think I am going to need to, sometimes saving works. This is a good, yeah, it's not going to work now. Let me close out of here and close the program. This is a good lesson in why I always suggest that you have a backup copy of NVivo. And let me see if I can go back and open that again and pull it back up. I'm just going to be quiet as I reopen it. Saving your project on a regular basis is an important part. When projects get really full, and this project is really full because I've created multiple folders and moved a lot of things around, then it's really good practice to have at least yesterday's work or a backup copy so that you can always go back to it. And this one is opening. Okay, and let me just go and open the project, and then I'll pull it back up for you.
Or let me know if you need me to open NVivo.
Yeah, nope, it's just coming up now. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're back in. And I was showing you how those codes look. Let me just run through that. I wanted to show you that when you actually move codes around, you can turn on the kind of what is called the parent code or the theme code, and you can actually turn on the aggregate coding from child codes, and it's going to pull up all of the coding from the codes that are beneath it. And that will give you a good sense of, you can come in then, you'll see that the number of files and the number of references have changed, and all of the coding that's in all of these child codes are now in this one top level theme code, which will allow you to make a really good decision about whether everything that's underneath here really belongs in this theme or topic. So that's the way that you start to move those codes around and begin to think about how those themes fit together, how you look at the codes to get a sense of what's in them, turn on the coding stripes, turn on the highlights, etc. So in the last couple of minutes, then I'll just show you then the progress of what these codes can look like as you move between them. So in phase one, we had that list of initial codes, which is really long. Remember, you want to probably export a code book at this point to document that. Then in phase two, I'm starting to get a sense of those themes and starting to put things together. Again, generate a code book documenting how the codes and definitions have changed. By phase three, you're starting to see some more structure here. I have some better ideas about what belongs together. And by phase four, we've got then really a nice, tidy, it looks like it was meant to be. It's all kind of laid out neat and tidy. And you've got all of these codes arranged with the sections that you're probably going to write about in your dissertation. Similarly, you will have your notes or your memos, I would suggest, also arranged, and you'll see here that I've got folders created for memos from my initial phase, my second phase, and so on. So that's another way that you can export the memos and your thoughts about what you were seeing in those themes, even key quotes, and use those to form the basis of your writing. Now, what if I was using a deductive approach to coding? How would that folder structure look different? In deductive, we often start with a framework or codes, an idea of the codes that we are looking for based on previous research, or potentially we're coding into a framework that someone else has developed. And part of our research question is to assess that or critique that framework and see if there's anything new that we can add to it. Maybe we've been using it and we think there's some things missing, etc. So in a deductive approach to coding, I may start with a list of codes before I even have data. And I've built those based on the framework or our previous work in the field. There's no references, there's no files in them. And then as I bring in my data, I still in qualitative research want to stay open to the new things I'm seeing. So perhaps as I bring in my interviews, I'm starting to see that people talk a lot about community, and that wasn't part of the previous framework, but I can see by what people are saying that I at least posit that this should be part of the framework. So you'll see that I've started to add some codes to that initial framework, as well as coding into the original codes. By phase 3, I'm getting to a similar kind of place that I would have in the phase 3 of the inductive approach. And by phase 4, kind of landing up in the same place. And of course, you would have memos documenting that would belong to each of these phases as well. So I wanted to show you how the folder structure changes over time, how the exporting of code books will document the coding structures and changes, and how you can use that to both fill in your methods section, provide evidence of the rigor of your research and audit trail, and also to help you as you go to write up those things. You're going to be exporting those memos and the thoughts and your ideas about the themes as they developed, including key quotes that you can link into those memos. Memos exported as Word documents become the basis of your report writing, and you've got those for the various sections of your report. Visualizing your data in ways of representing the code structure. Of course, the code book is a visual representation, but there are also different visualizations in NVivo, like word clouds, word trees, charts, hierarchy charts, all kinds of things that are both useful to you in the analysis process and potentially useful to you in reporting, depending on your audience. Many of the visualizations are not necessarily things you would put into a dissertation, but you may add them to your poster, or you may use them with your committee to give them a visual representation of what you're seeing. And that can often engage people very much in the discussion. So again, depending on your audience, the way you begin to move past the coding and into writing, which we'll talk about again tomorrow, those visualizations can be helpful, but also helpful to you in being able to see themes in your data that you may not have seen otherwise. And I would very much encourage you to click through on that webinar about visualization to see how, I think that one is Dr. Stuart Robertson. He does a great job of talking about the visualizations. And also for you to see another demo about thematic analysis, the reference on the slide for that. That is a webinar, I think, by Dr. Ben Meehan, and he is one of the NVivo gurus. I think you'll really enjoy that webinar as well. So Stacy, I think that's it for me.
Great, awesome, thank you. I did send you some questions, and
okay.
It's great. We're getting a ton of questions, and we'll do the best to answer as many as we can. So just if you'd be patient with us. So I'm going make myself presenter. All right, and I just wanted to show how you could bring in Citavi into NVivo, but before I do, I just quick, Citavi is meant to be used for your secondary sources, so like your literature review, and NVivo would be used for your primary sources, the data that you're collecting. So I'm just going to go into Citavi here and go to this creativity project. Oop, should have had it open already. So what will happen here is I have my Citavi project, I have all my references in Citavi, and I would go to File in Citavi and go to Export, and Export, I have an option to export. I'm going to do all references, and to export to NVivo. So it creates a file type that NVivo can read. So I'd do that and I would save it. I have it on my desktop, so I'll show you what that looks like when I open up NVivo. So for example, if I go to a new project, and So now I have a blank project, but what I can do is I can bring in my Citavi project by going to import, and I have an option for a bibliography. So I'll go to Citavi here and I'll go find the project I want to bring in. And then we have this wizard, and I'm going to pick for title. I like to do author and year when it comes in, and it's going to save it to my files folder, and I'll import. Now you can see it's importing the Citavi references. And so you can see I have the references. A lot of these were what I had shown yesterday. So they're right in NVivo now. So along with bringing in the PDFs, they also it also brings in the metadata from the article. So it has what type of reference, the author, the year of publication, the page numbers, all that. And if you had any notes, and if there was an abstract, that would be in Memos here. So it'll also bring that information in from Citavi, so the abstract and keywords and so on. And then you can do a lot of what Laura just showed you in NVivo with the documents or the articles here. We are continuing. We will continue to work on Citavi and NVivo integration. So you'll probably hear more about that in the future. But this is what we can do now with the two software. So I'll go over now to questions. And well, wait, before I do that, I forgot yesterday's show resources here. So I just wanted to also highlight resources from Dissertation by Design that's in the handout. And then also the different software packages you can get with Citavi and NVivo, the Citavi trial. Again, the different products for NVivo. So NVivo transcription, NVivo desktop, NVivo collaboration cloud, and then we have ways to help learn the software. So Laura is one of our certified trainers, and then some free resources. And then this is NVivo Academy to help you learn the software. And of course, consider joining the community. So with that, I'll go to Veronica. I know you had a ton of questions. Would you like to answer like maybe 2 at this point, or we'll see what time we have?
Yeah. Let's see here. So one question that I get often is, how do we not drown in our data? And I would say to that, if you're feeling that way, then you're probably doing some things right, okay? Because it can be very, very overwhelming, as Laura said. NVivo, for me, really helps me be able to breathe and know that all of my codes and categories or groupings are there, and I can always go back and refine. So I think one thing to think about is to not worry about being perfect. You're going to continue to check yourself the whole way through, whether you're doing your analysis by hand or in a computer-aided software program such as NVivo. The other thing I would say is not to rush. I see a lot of novice researchers trying to get through their data collection quicker, and only to find out that the writing is extremely hard when we have not done the work in our analysis. So as I mentioned in one of the documents that I posted for you, or that Stacy posted for you, think your analysis needs to take around four weeks, around a month, depending on how much time you have to devote. That 4 weeks is about 10 to 15 hours per week. If you can do that much time per week, devote that much time to your study, count on about 4 hours, 4 weeks for your analysis. Now, if you have a lot of data, that's going to be extended. So do the work up front. It makes the writing, as we will see tomorrow, go much quicker. And that's what we want. We want the writing to go quicker and let the analysis take us some time. All right. Another question was, if during your coding processes you find a topic that was not a topic prior to that, what do you do? So, for example, if this person was using a deductive analysis, but something else is emerging in the data and it keeps coming up, what do you do with that? I say you code it and you create another discovery, which is great, because in that instance, if we recognize that there's something else there for this group of people and in this particular setting or context, you could be making a theoretical proposition, if you will, that something else needs to be added. And that's a great place to be. Do you want me to go ahead and do one more, or?
Yeah, why don't you do one more and then I'll have Laura do one.
Okay. Another question that I thought was good and we should be thinking about is, how do you determine whether to use inductive or deductive analysis? I guess my advice for this would be, in most qualitative research, we're doing inductive analysis first. We're seeing what emerges from the ground up. We're taking that micro level view, looking at the data first. Unless there's something that, let's say that I'm reviewing a program, and within that program, they are touting that they align with a theory, then I might want to do deductive analysis based on that theory to see what's actually aligning. That would be one of those times where I definitely want to know, are they really doing what they're saying to be doing? And this is kind of like an evaluation study as well. So I really look to inductive analysis first and then deductive, just as a natural part of our analysis process as qualitative researchers. But the other thing that might come up, and I had this happen with a few of my students, is they want to know the inductive side, but then they also are curious about a theory, if there's something going on with the theory. And they actually did two types of analysis. They did the inductive first, put that aside, and then did a whole new analysis with the theory. That type of a study, while it takes longer, is much more rigorous and can prove beneficial for the particular field. All right, thanks, Stacy.
Thanks so much, Veronica. Laura, did you want to answer a question that you had?
Yes, it would help to answer if I come off mute. That usually helps. So should I answer one of the ones you sent? I've put most of the responses there. Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah, there's one.
I think one of the most helpful ones for people to see would be, one of the questions was, can you export into a Word or Excel file a specific code with the text sections under that code and include the memos in that document? So the memos wouldn't be included in the document, but you can export the memos separately, so that wouldn't be hard to link. And again, this varies a little bit whether or not you're using NVivo for Windows or NVivo for Mac. And I think I forgot to say today that I am using NVivo for Windows and the most recent version of NVivo. If you're using NVivo 12 or NVivo for Mac, it will look different than what I was showing you today. But most of these things are possible in NVivo 12 as well. Some of the things vary a little bit in NVivo for Mac. So I need to share my screen, I think, if I could,
Sure.
Stacy.
Yep, I'll make you a presenter. Hold on.
Okay, and show my screen. And I didn't give you the otter this time. So here is, I'm back in the sample project, and let's say I want to export this balance code. Typically, the way I do things in NVivo, there's so many ways to do the same task. NVivo doesn't care which way you do it, as long as you find one that works for you. I'm going to right-click over that code, export, and notice that I can export the code, and then it gives me a window with a bunch of different options. If you're using NVivo for Mac, this will look a little bit different. I can export the entire content as an HTML file, and that allows anybody to look at that content by using a browser such as Google Chrome to open up what's in the code, and they'll see all of the excerpts of the text and so on. So that's a very fulsome way to be able to do it. I could also choose, or instead choose, to just export the text, and that would be the reference view. So that would be, if I open the code, that would just be what you're seeing as text files, but some of the other pieces would that are audio and video would not be going through. So I'm going to go back to that export code option. And then a summary view just gives a list of what's actually in the code. If I look on the summary view of this code, it would just give you a list of what's in there. So this is what would export. So there are multiple ways to export the code and the code content. You can choose the format. You can choose to include see also links. You can include the memo links, which would show you that there is a linked memo, but it wouldn't include the content for all of the memo. At least I don't think so. So I'm going to try and export that, Stacy, just as we're finishing up here, and see if I can get that to open as an HTML file.
Sure.
And then folks can see what that looks like. Again, if you're using NVivo for Mac, it might give you very different options. So just nope, it's not going to work. So I'll just leave it there. It's partly because I've got a lot of things open, and it's not going to do that. So, okay, I'll just stop sharing my screen here.
Great. Well, thank you both to Veronica and Laura for great demonstrations, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We have one more session tomorrow.